Over the years, I've had a few encounters with Tom Gilson, a conservative evangelical apologist. They've been generally pleasant until a few weeks ago. I had posted a video on my YouTube channel where I critique Sean McDowell because Sean McDowell had posted a short video where he claims that progressive Christianity is another religion. I critiqued Sean McDowell, and Tom Gilson apparently didn't like that. It so upset him, indeed, that he felt the need to resurrect his moribund blog and to write an article in the blog just responding to my critique of Sean McDowell. I read his blog article and I responded in a subsequent video, and we also had some back and forth after that on Twitter before I decided just to disengage. What I learned is that Tom Gilson, he talks about logic, reason, and evidence a lot, but he also has a tendency to avoid the central issue, which became clearly evident in my exchange with him, that he refused to defend or address the central thesis Sean McDowell had proposed, that progressive Christianity is another religion. And when I challenged him on that and invited him and asked him repeatedly to address the central issue and either to defend Sean McDowell or not, he refused to do so. Well, Tom Gilson's up to the same thing more recently. He posted an article a few days ago on a conservative website called The Stream, in which he claims that, well, he takes me to task for an exchange I had with Doug Groothuis last summer on Unbelievable with Justin Brierley, where I was defending progressive Christianity against Doug Groothuis, who was presenting an evangelical perspective. And in the exchange, I was explaining that one of the characteristics of progressive Christianity generally is a prioritization of right action over right belief, of orthopraxy over orthodoxy. So he wrote the article. We're going to take a look at the article, and then we're going to take a look at the debate itself, and then I'll offer some thoughts. So here's the article. Right actions are more important than right beliefs. Progressive Christianity contradicts itself again. Yep, what are you going to do? Okay, Tom Gilson begins. He says, the difference between evangelicals and progressive Christians, says one progressive, is a greater focus on right action than right belief. It's more important than getting all our beliefs right. Gilson then says this, I want to zero in specifically on that one statement because it makes so amazingly little sense. Now, this for me is a classic example of what I've discovered is Tom Gilson's incessant penchant for rhetorical overreach. It's not enough for him just to say he disagrees with something. What he has to do is to say it is just absurd, or it's ridiculous, or it's amazing that anybody could offer a claim such as that orthopraxy is of more importance in the life of the Christian than orthodoxy. He then turns to the podcast exchange I had, the debate I had with Groothuis, and he notes that I tell a story from the 1994 Rwandan genocide, in which there was a Christian pastor who was complicit in genocide and a Muslim peacekeeper with the United Nations who saved the lives of people who would otherwise have been lost in the genocide. And I said, between those two options, if you have an option of which legacy you would want to have standing before the throne of God, that of the Christian genocidaire or that of the Muslim peacekeeper, which would you rather be? Now, Doug Groothuis responded, and here's his summary. He says, Groothuis, sitting opposite him by video, answered by saying it's both and, not an either or, and that we're saved by God's grace alone. He's right. So he agrees with he agrees with Doug Groothuis. Doug Groothuis is right and I'm wrong, and he can now just dismiss the thought experiment. Not so. What I want to do now is actually play the clip where I share the thought experiment, play Doug Groothuis' response where he tries to frame it as a false dichotomy, and then I'm going to keep playing and show my response to Doug Groothuis. So let's take a look. Okay. Take it away, Randall. With that in mind, I'd like to pose a scenario and get Doug's feedback. This is something I used in one of my books years ago. In the 1994 Rwanda genocide, there was an Seventh-day Adventist pastor named Elizaphan Nkatarama, who was among the Hutus, which were the class that was killing the Tutsis. And his congregants were mostly Tutsi, and they contacted him in hiding and were asking him for help. And instead, he sent the militias to kill them. The other individual is Mabayi Diagne. He was a Muslim,
and he was with the UN peacekeeping forces. Every day he set aside the command to stay within his post because he was unarmed, and he went out and he rescued the people in his Jeep and bargained back through Hutu checkpoints with a bunch of Tutsis in his Jeep, using good humor and bartering with cigarettes. And with that incredible courage and selflessness, he managed to save, I think, close to 100 people. Now, on the one hand, you've got a person who believed rightly, you could say, setting aside the Seventh-day Adventist nuances, right? But someone who's a Christian pastor, and yet they lived in such a way that was fundamentally incompatible with the gospel. And then you have somebody who lived in a way that seemed to be much more consistent with the gospel, but for a Christian had the wrong beliefs. And my question is, which one would you choose to be on Judgment Day, right, standing before the throne of God? And I suspect that many progressives, when they'd answer that question, they would say they would rather be Mabaya Diagne, because they think it's more important to have right action than right belief.
Well, I think it's a false, that's a good illustration. I had not heard that before. I think it's a false dichotomy. The gospel says that we are saved by the grace of God through the work of Jesus Christ plus nothing, and we receive that with the empty hands of faith. And if we are truly regenerate, then we should do good works. It's a both and, it's not an either or. And Christians can make some very bad decisions and do some terrible things that may indicate they're not Christians at all. That's God's call. Or it may indicate that they are regenerate, but they have simply missed the mark horribly on a particular issue. But I just have to go to the fundamental gospel there and say we are not saved by any amount of good works that we do. Paul says, through the works of the law shall no one be justified.
There are 2 points that Grotius made in response, which Tom Gilson explicitly appeals to the one and I think implicitly also to the other. And the first is that he's alleging that I'm engaged in a false dichotomy, and second, that I'm suggesting that the Muslim was saved by good works. And that's where Tom Gilson leaves the exchange. Now, the important thing to recognize is that I then offer a rebuttal to Doug Grotius. So I'm going to play the rebuttal, and then you decide whether it is relevant in responding to Doug Grotius's point or not. Okay, we're now going to see my response.
The claim is not that the Muslim is saved by good works.
Okay.
We would accept that they were saved by Christ. But that I guess that you'd pose the question like this: what is the evidence that Christ is active in a person's life? Mm-hmm. Right? Which is better evidence, that they have the right beliefs, or that they're conforming to the patterns of what it is to be Christ living in the world? I mean, of course, C.S. Lewis at the end of The Last Battle, right? He famously gives the example of very inclusivist theology. I think a lot of people miss it, but he talks about this fellow who worshiped the false god Tash, but nonetheless, those prayers and praises to Tash were accepted by Aslan, and he realized after the fact that he was in the right relationship with Aslan. And so that's the kind of scenario I'm posing.
Okay. Yeah, so that would be that regenerative faith or regenerative action by God could be operative in the midst of a non-Christian religion without
well, sure, that would be like that could be like, that's a Roman Catholic position since Vatican II.
Yeah. Well, perhaps it's hard to answer that fully in this kind of a setting. I deal with this at some length in Christian apologetics in the chapter on religious pluralism, but I want to rule out, and you do too, salvation by works. It has to be through the work of Christ. Now, how much do you have to know in order to benefit from the saving work of Jesus Christ?
Okay, we're now back at the article. So I want to come back here. He says, Doug Grotius, sitting opposite to Rausser, answered by saying it's a both and, not an either or, and that we're saved by God's grace alone. He's right. So the thing here that notably then what Tom Gilson never provides is the fact that I gave a rebuttal to Doug Grotius's misinterpretation of the thought experiment by that would take it as suggesting that you're saved by works. And I pointed out it implies an inclusivist theology, one that was held by the Catholic Church, that was held by C.S. Lewis. And Doug Grotius then doesn't dispute that. And yet Tom Gilson chooses not to address that. I also want to explicitly address the fact that Tom Gilson assumes Doug Grotius's assumption that this is a false dichotomy. That is manifestly false. It's not a false dichotomy. It's a thought experiment considering the respective values of 2 different scenarios. So imagine you're in the woods, okay? You're lost in the woods, and you could have one of two things, a compass or a Bowie knife. Which one would you choose, the compass or the Bowie knife? If you respond by saying, it's a false dichotomy, I can have both, what you're simply doing is refusing to participate in the thought experiment, which is aiming to compare and evaluate two respective values, that of having a compass in the woods versus having a Bowie knife in the woods. The thought experiment is a perfectly legitimate one, whether you want to play the game or not. And it's exactly the same here. To say that it is a false dichotomy to have a life of Mabai Diagni or the life of Elizaphan Nakatarama is not a false dichotomy. What it is doing is presenting you a thought experiment to compare the respective value of orthodoxy and orthopraxy. So you can decide, would you rather be the person who had Orthodox Christian confession and yet was participant in genocide, or the person who did not have an Orthodox Christian confession? They were in fact a Muslim, but they in fact gave their lives for their neighbor and lived more consistently with the life and teaching of Jesus. And many people will say, definitely, they would rather be Mabai Diagni. I'm going to say that I would rather be Mabai Diagni. What's intriguing here is how Tom Gilson says the position of preferring that, and with an inclusivist theology such as the Roman Catholic Church or C.S. Lewis would hold, that it makes amazingly little sense, he says. So apparently, when C.S. Lewis in The Last Battle talks about this man Emmet meaning truth in Hebrew, he lived his life ostensibly worshiping Tash, a false god, but he in fact loved his neighbor. And Aslan says, I've accepted your worship to Tash as unto me. Now, it seems to me Lewis is clearly endorsing a position that apparently Tom Gilson finds to be amazingly weak position, that he can't understand how anybody could hold such a position. Let's take a look at the final section of the article where Tom Gilson tries to again address my position. The one thing I should say is in between this opening section and the conclusion, there is a long section where Tom Gilson talks about transgender people and gay people and open borders and socialism, a bunch of things that I guess are hot button topic for American Republicans who want to fight a culture war, but which have nothing directly to do with the issue under debate, which again is just, I think this is a tendency that Tom Gilson has to avoid what the central issue is. But he does try to grapple with the central issue at the conclusion of the article, so we're going to now take a look at that. Okay, starting here, he says, in the final analysis, everyone acts according to what they believe, not what they say they believe, but what they actually believe. Rouser said that Rwandan pastor believed rightly. Nonsense. Obviously, he believed it was far better to kill the innocent oppressed than to help them. That's not believing rightly. I don't know if Tom Gilson is being intellectually disingenuous here or if he's just really that confused. When I said that Elizaphan Nakatarama was believing rightly, I wasn't saying he was believing rightly with respect to how Rwandan Tutsis ought to be treated. I was saying he was believing rightly with respect to the confession of Orthodox Christian statements of belief, like the Apostles' Creed and the Nicene Creed. And the point is that you can, in fact, confess those doctrines and yet live in a way that is fundamentally discordant with the life and teaching of Jesus. So then he goes on and he says, maybe he also said he believed in God, Christ, and salvation. Maybe in a way he did. Then his beliefs were inconsistent, some of them right and some of them deadly wrong. That's not because he was evangelical. It's because he was human. Well, nobody said it was because he was evangelical. I don't know where that came from. But the point is that Tom Gilson is actually tacitly conceding the main point here, which is that you confess the Apostles' Creed, you can confess the Apostles' Creed, you can confess the Nicene Creed, and yet live fundamentally inconsistently with the life and teaching of Jesus. And if you have a decision to come back to the thought experiment, to be the one who had all your doctrinal ducks in a row, you affirmed the doctrine of creation and fall, triune God, incarnation, atonement, resurrection, second coming, ascension, new heavens and new earth, general resurrection, all of the major doctrines. And yet, in the moment when it mattered, you rationalized killing your neighbor in a genocide. And the other guy was a Muslim who sought to live out the 5 pillars of Islam, but who nonetheless, in the moment when it mattered, he stood up for those people that you were trying to kill. Which one would you rather be? Would you rather be the Christian pastor or the Muslim? No matter what Tom Gilson wants to say by way of red herring, obfuscation, or deflection, or non sequitur, the thought experiment remains. And if you think it is, well, let me come up with his words again. If you think it makes amazingly little sense to consider the possibility that a person might value orthopraxy over orthodoxy, not that they disvalue orthodoxy, but that they believe loving your neighbor is even more important. If you think that makes amazingly little sense, then I'm going to have to say that I don't think you've begun to grapple with the theological and ethical issues that are at stake here. To conclude, I believe that, in fact, it is Tom Gilson's response to me which makes amazingly little sense.